Well, greetings. It's Dr. Blevins again, and this is another short video, hopefully to add additional information to build around our conversation around, well, leadership in part, but also understanding how we see that leadership in light of both team development as well as intentional and implicit structures that guide our leadership and our engagement. So, if you're charting this against a lot of the other material in the class, just a reminder that we have already talked about two ways of approaching leadership and entrepreneurship and design thinking. One way is through the language of how do we sort of think about the infrastructure of an organization and definitely the human infrastructure, so that we are talking about the people as well as, well, some of the other elements of it, what constitutes a firm, including elements like organization and marketing and um, services that are being developed, but also how do we really make sure that we have an organization that is human and that includes the components that we need to protect it. And then we also recognize that while fast track curriculum is really good about thinking about that structure, organizational structure, as you might put it on paper to see how it's made manifest through all the forms and different materials, we also, through our reading this time and looking at basically this idea of leading congregations and nonprofits in a connected world, we talked about the dynamics that are going on or the process and culture of an organization, to which we discussed at least three sort of major components that any organization has organically, sort of understanding how an organization tends to respond in the midst of both, well, internal dynamics, but also how that organization is postured outwardly and engaging the culture around itself, and whether it really is even oriented more outward and what it wants to do, or more inwardly and who it is in the midst of that engagement. We talked about the importance of really how decisions are made and whether they're more unilateral or more of a process, which is what the reading is encouraging in a 3.0 environment. And we also talked about how well an organization communicates, the culture of communication. One way to think about it. Um, Big in the book is storytelling, but just how is it that we know that the responsiveness, the decision making, and the communication are part of that culture as you navigate, well, the outline of the manifest written out organization. What does that look like more explicitly or implicitly as that organization begins to build out and appear as a given sort of culture? And how we both characterize that, not caricature it, but characterize that and recognize. In the book, there's a lot about hierarchical systems versus organic systems. There might be other ways to think about it, but at least how the cultures within an organization, no matter what it looks like in print, how it tends to operate and its responsiveness and decision making communication more hierarchically, or how it tends to operate in more organic terms, like a network, is part of what the reading's encouraging us to think about. Well, there's one more piece to keep in mind as we move forward, and that is also the organizational dynamics as it sort of engages change. And what does it mean to take an organization through periods of change? And how do we understand these systems? It's one thing to have a chart. It's even one thing to have almost, if you would think of it like an ethnography that's written out. It's another thing to actually see that ethnography in dynamic interaction with each other. And how do we envision, well, responsiveness and communication and decision making to occur as it actually happens? And understanding any firm, any organization, any church as a dynamic system, not a static one, is almost as important when you think whether the system is hierarchical or organic, networked. What happens when it begins to move? And one of the best books that I've ever discovered that helps was actually written in the 1990s that launched a movement that it continues to live till today, and that is through the writings of Peter Senge and his first book, really the Fifth Discipline, which began to take a dynamic systems approach. So you can talk about systems in a kind of static way, but he was saying, what happens when systems are in motion? And do they tend to work in straight lines, or do they tend to be more, well, circular and therefore adaptive? Um, and if it's circular, then how is it that basically an organization uh, moves through decision making and communications? Is it just straight down, straight up, or is it more like, well, a feedback loop, and there are intersections and even gaps between different types of communication, different forms of responsiveness? And the most basic example that Senge uses is that of a water faucet. And when you're trying to turn it on, here he's got it basically just getting water flow, which is when you start the water, and when you have to turn it off before the last small bit of water actually hits the cup. I think anybody who knows, if you're staring at the cup, wait until it gets there, and you haven't started to even screw back down the faucet or close it down or whatever, you may get more than you think. But a better way to think about it is when you're trying to get water, say to take a shower, and initially comes out cold, and then you want to get it hot, but you tend to get it too hot, and then you try to modify it into something warm. And basically, what he's saying is that there is a certain position, there's a certain water flow volume that's coming to a certain level, and then a certain temperature, and there's always a perceived gap for what we desire, whether it be at a water level or a temperature, and what we actually get. And the reason that's so important is because in that gap, we often make decisions before we see the fullness of an outcome. And we sometimes find ourselves, well, minding the gap, living in the gap, particularly when we start to realize that it's not merely our own decisions that are being made, but there are others. Out of that sort of basic metaphor, he begins to say, well, how does this change the way we think? Well, this first one obviously is basically one that's really important, is because that water flow out of the fountain depends on a faucet, excuse me, depends on a whole lot of different things. And water flow, when you begin to figure in water temperature and you begin to figure out people's tastes and expectations, small wonder we live in a much more complex world. So his basic five principles are these, and this is kind of, I'll read these to you in a way. So the first one's that of systems thinking, that the world is not created or of separate, unrelated forces. However, individuals have difficulty seeing the whole pattern. It's hard to recognize when there's 5 or 6 different faucets running at different speeds, different temperatures, much less how they might intersect and influence each other. And anyone who's ever stayed in a house with 5 kids know exactly what I'm talking about from that standpoint. Systems thinking is a conceptual framework, a body of knowledge and tools that's been developed over, I'd say now, the past 60 to 70 years, but starting with very early studies, almost with microorganisms in biology, but also other kinds of models of systems thinking. And the whole goal of systems thinking is to try to make full patterns clearer to help us see how to change things effectively and with the least amount of effort. In other words, to find the lever in the system that sometimes makes all the difference in the world. And yes, you could change water flow by going and turning on and off your water heater, for instance. It's not a very efficient way of doing that. Much less could you do that in some ways, even in how you adjust a nozzle or and how that operates. But how is it that we begin to see organizations as dynamic systems, often running up and against each other, many times with sort of different goals and needs that sometimes begin to bump up? And where's the lever point to actually bring about change is one of the points that he's arguing for. Secondly, the next one that he thinks is important, Senge stresses, is that of personal mastery. He says it is the discipline of continually clarifying and deepening our personal vision. Remember, we started talking about that from the very first week of this semester, of focusing our energies, developing patience, of seeing reality objectively. The discipline of personal mastery starts with clarifying the things that really matter to us, are living our lives in service of our highest aspirations. So it's that perception point in the gap sometimes, and how we ourselves sort of develop our own sense of living in the midst of these systems without being overwhelmed by them in one form or fashion. The third thing that he thinks is really important inside his model is sort of building a sort of shared vision. The practice of shared vision involves skills of unearthing shared pictures of the future that foster continued genuine commitment, enrollment, rather than just compliance. How do we bring people into those? Often through the power of what he would call mental models. That's another term you'll hear on occasion, that are just basically deeply ingrained assumptions, generalizations, even pictures or images that influence how we understand the world and take action. The discipline of working with mental models start with turning the mirror inward, learning to unearth our own internal pictures of the world to bring the service and hold them rigorously to scrutiny. And so what he's saying is that the mental models are part of the goal of reaching a kind of shared vision because different people have different mental models. We bring these assumptions of how the world works. And how do we as a leader navigate in the midst of those and even provide at times a way of even being self-critical of how our own mental models are at work? The next two things are really important. Team learning then becomes really important. He says the discipline of team learning starts with dialogue, the capacity of members of a team to suspend assumptions and enter into a genuine thinking together. Dialogue for him is different than discussion. He relates discussion to concussion. There's a kind of tendency to be competitive to get one's ideas across, where a dialogue tends to suspend those. In some ways, much like design thinking, anticipating that there's a problem there that is yet to be determined and fully solved. So there's a tendency to release one's ownership and solutions to begin to understand how we might dialogue with each other. And then metanoia is just a shift of minds, that really what happens is that if we practice this principle of metanoia, that systems thinking needs disciplines in such a way that help us to kind of change our perspective, bring together the mental models, the shared vision, and the team learning in such a way that we can begin to see things in a much broader dynamic way, that we can see the systems and we can begin to envision how to move beyond those systems and to begin to work within them. Sengay's work is probably, even though the book was done in, oh man, 1990, so it's over 35 years, almost 35 years now, it sparked an entire line of work around it. Ronald Heifetz at Harvard probably is best known as a business consultant and an educator who's consulted with major corporations and even governments around the world. And he and Marty Linsky wrote a book, Leadership on the Line, Staying Alive During the Dangers of Leading, recognizing that sometimes as organizations go through change that we find ourselves in sort of liminal spaces and how to navigate those changes. And Heifetz is very famous about learning how to get off the floor and onto the balcony. That was his metaphor, be able to sort of, again, practice that kind of personal mastery to think through systems, to see the dynamics that are going on, and then begin to see the whole and what it takes to get out of the embeddedness so that one can move that way. All of this has basically resulted then in a process called leading via adaptation. So it's not so much I drive things forward, but that in the midst of the change, how am I adaptive and how can I make a difference as a result of that? How can I learn in the midst of the changes that will occur? And what are the skill sets to develop a kind of practice of adaptive leadership? Now, at Nazarene Theological Seminary, we actually have a different course that spends a whole lot more time on this. But I wanted to offer this micro lecture, if you will, just to remind us that even as we are leading organizations into the future, we have to at least attend to the dynamic processes and the complex processes that are going on. And if you are envisioning starting a brand new venture or even engaging in your own life in a creative new way, as those unpack themselves, however we wrote it down, even in the business plan that we submit, probably will not work out exactly that way. So, how are we already poised to sort of respond in the midst of those moments? How can we be both communities and churches of learning so that we might be adaptive as we go along? Well, there are a couple of books that sort of highlight this, but before I talk about them, I did want to take a moment to walk you through the 11 laws of the fifth discipline. This may be singularly one of the gifts that Peter Senge gave out of his book that I think are still helpful for us as we move forward in leading today. The first law, which I think is really important, is that today's problems come from yesterday's solutions. And so many times the things that we're trying to address probably did, if we took time to actually look them up, probably were a pretty good idea in the past. There was a reason for that decision, for that instituting whatever that model was in those times. And now, yeah, like many decisions, they've reached their limits, and now's an opportunity to make an adjustment. But I hope you hear the irony in that, because that probably means that the solutions, the innovations, the interventions we offer today that as answers for problems today may well be contributing to future problems down the road. So no matter how much you think you're correcting all the mistakes of the past, recognize that there'll probably be someone somewhere in the future that will name you as part of that problem of the past and be helping a different era to try to think and be adaptive in the midst of that period. That I actually think that's pretty helpful for both leaders and prophets of any era who think they're really trying to evoke massive change. It's kind of the moment of, for lack of a better way of saying it, of Jonah under the mustard seed tree that just recognizes that, I thought I had it all right, and I guess I really didn't know exactly what was going on. It's that kind of healthy sense of humor that we talked about in other times, even with mentors in our own leadership posture at times. The next few are really more what happens as we engage systems. So these are just sort of maxims that he wants you to think about so you're not surprised by them. Not that this will automatically happen this way, but they're important. So the second one is, a lot of times the harder you push, the harder the system pushes back. And so sometimes when you're trying to bring about change, don't be surprised when even people who conceptually agree with you later just seem to be resisting you anyway. Systems like status, they like to basically, all systems like to be at rest. And there's a principle basically that just of homeostasis that just basically says anytime you disrupt a system, what it really wants to do is move back to a state of stasis. They may be moving, but it knows exactly where everything is. And the minute you try to get something to change, recognize that rigidity against that change may well happen. Um, Anyone who has a pet who decides on occasion to try to get a pet to move when it doesn't want to has an idea of what this is all about. Third principle is that we just got to recognize sometimes that behavior grows better before it grows worse. If I could teach this one to pastors all around the world, I would. A lot of times we think we'll offer new ideas, a new pastor, for instance, or a new leader, and we think everybody is automatically going to get in line. We feel pretty good about it. And then, well, a little bit later, it starts to feel like the back end of a Seinfeld episode as things start to seem to unravel. So just recognize that early compliance is not an indicator that everything is going to work really well. Fourth one is important, though, that the easy way out usually leads back in. That many times when we try to seek simple solutions to avoid problems, we just find ourselves just creating new problems, and we find ourselves still stuck. And so a lot of times, hard work will have to be done before it's over. Number five may sound weird, but sometimes the cure can be worse than the disease, is that I have seen organizations at times evoke changes where they think they have to just correct some kind of massive inequity of the past. They do it in a rush, and it seems to be working well, only to realize they've instituted something that's even worse. Why? Well, one of the principles that it is true in systems theory is often when we start something, we're not the only decider in those systems that have to contribute to what's going on. And so we may sometimes actually engage in something we think is very helpful, but because of a series of decisions that follow after us that work across the system, all of a sudden things are even worse in how the organization's overall health is going. So, a good example that I've seen on this is sometimes when people try to correct bad mistakes of a previous leader and they work to try to come up with a plan that can actually correct those mistakes, only realize that the process of putting the plan together and implementing it creates even a greater tension within the organization than some of the leaders' previous decisions were. And they didn't see that coming. They couldn't have. They couldn't have because they didn't know all the decisions that were going to be wrapped up in it. And so they many times that leads to the sixth discipline or principle, which is that faster is slower. And what Senge means by that is sometimes what we think are quick fixes actually merely just prolong and cause us to wrestle longer with the system with systemic issues. Number seven principle is that cause and effect are closely related, are not closely related in time and space. This goes back to that perceived gap that we just talked about. And sometimes you can initiate something and 6 months later be surprised at a result that you did not see coming. And so, and it would be tied back to that initial decision, but that and you can even see its relationship, but where it shows up and when it shows up might be not necessarily of your control. Number eight is that small changes can produce big results, but the areas of highest leverage are often the least obvious. This one in systems thinking is one that drives most leaders insane. It means that because there are so many moving parts, if you want to think about that way dynamically, you may make a fix in a place that that you didn't even realize was actually helping that organization move forward in a healthy way, or you may recognize that maybe all this organization needs is a couple of small adjustments. In my course in congregational discipleship, a lot of times I argue if you want to make a congregation more faithful, sometimes it's the small adjustments that are more important than instituting massive program changes. Knowing where those adjustments need to be made sometimes are really not as obvious as we think. And that's really important. Number nine, I think is self-evident. You can have your cake and eat it too, but not all at once. And Senge explains that, but we can see certain things come to fruition, but probably not at the pace that we thought they were going to happen. Remember that gap always means that other people might be participating in the elements of decision that we're making. Number 10 is one I think a lot of people discovered in different ways over time, but dividing an elephant in half does not produce two small elephants. Um, that sometimes this is actually an axiom that has reminded me of things in small groups. That sometimes you might ask for one or two people to launch a group, but if you walk into a group that has a lot of homeostasis and is doing really well, you say, this group is so wonderful, I'm just going to ask you to divide into two and start reaching out to other people, only realize you just basically created two very weak groups. There are a lot of times, even inside organizations, when you begin to sort of divide up tasks and divide up other things, they're not always easily addressed as you think because of the need for the organic relationship. But of all of these, probably the best principle out of the 11th laws of the fifth discipline that I ever liked is the last one, number 11, because this goes back actually to, well, number one, but also three, four, and five. That a lot of times the decisions that you think are really helpful um, really turn out to be more problematic than you realize. And it's not because of the decision you made personally as the leader, it's all the other elements that had to respond in the midst of it. And therefore, there is no blame. This is one, and I'll confess to you, I have to sometimes wrestle with when we walk in and we see problems within an organization and we want to bring about change, but the real danger is to blame something or someone in the past without recognizing that it's probably better just not to focus on that and just ask what else might be done and what can be done as a result of it. Uh, and taking that approach also helps you as a leader sometimes when you recognize that when you do make decisions and things don't work out quite the way you hope, there might be a tendency to often just blame ourselves as if we're God and we can manage everything that's going on. And instead just recognize, no, our all too human decision just did not come to the fruition that we hoped for. So there is no blame doesn't mean that you leave things in bad shape, that you don't try to bring about change, that you don't try to learn to adapt and respond in the midst of even good things turning south for or turning bad for a while and needing adjustment and attunement. And that people need to continue to stay learning in a learning posture in the midst of those changes. No, you don't let that happen. You just don't own it just for yourself. Recognize that often systems bring about certain issues that you yourself alone do not control. This is Dr. Blevins saying to himself and to the camera, but also saying to you, you're not God. There's no omniscience, no omnipotence there. We are all working within multiple systems and we're trying to do what we can as faithfully and carefully as possible. Now, having run through those 11 laws, I would say there are two books that are emblematic. One, very few people know. Thomas Hawkins wrote a book in the early 2000s titled The Learning Congregation that I still think is one of the best books of taking principles of adaptive leadership and translating them into local church culture. So he did a great job in doing that, and it is a vision of leadership that's based on adaptive leadership principles. And I would recommend, it's probably a book you could get fairly inexpensively, that if you want a sort of Christian primer of the work of Heifetz and Sengay, The Learning Congregation is a still good book to access. On the evangelical side, since Tom Hawkins was at a mainline seminary when he wrote it, probably Tom Bolsinger, who is probably the person best recognized for adapting adapting adaptive leadership or importing adaptive leadership into his vision. And the book probably most people know by now is Canoeing the Mountains, Christian Leadership in Uncharted Territory. And Bolsinger comes pretty close to what we're doing in this class when we think about it from the standpoint of transformational leadership and how we're using this. Though Bolsinger uses that language in light of where he is operating instead of what we're doing. So a reminder from our standpoint, transformational leadership includes the ability to guide people into discontinuous change, uncharted future. So in that way, we are very close to canoeing the mountains, but also empowering others at the same time. What Bolsinger would argue is that, part of that includes our adaptive capacity alongside the competencies and the relational congruences that we're engaged in. His one way in his book, he really uses the Lewis and Clark expedition as a metaphor, basically understanding how do you chart a way forward into a territory where you don't have maps. And as you get the idea, so what do you do with canoes in the mountains? But even as you have not knowing whether there's going to be another river on the other side is one way to think of it or probably in the way in which we have talked about it in class is how is it that basically you're ready to help sort of navigate the risk that's involved anytime we're moving into discontinuous change, and at the same time from designing your life having at least a compass if not a map moving forward, sort of recognizing what true north is in the midst of our own leadership. Basically, Bolsinger begins with this famous quote: perhaps the most important thing to remember is that God is taking us into uncharted territory to transform us. The great discovery in following Christ into his mission is not that we find ourselves, into his mission is that we find ourselves, excuse me, is that we find ourselves. And the beautiful paradox is that the more committed we are to our own transformation, the better leader we will be in life. Now, that's important to recognize in the way the book is written. It's not so much written about how do I understand the nature of the organization, but how do I understand who I am and who I need to be as a leader so that I can be a transformative leader. And he would argue that to do that is to really adopt a sort of kind of framework in which we engage. The first piece of which he calls technical competence. Now, we've talked about skill sets in the class, and basically for him, technical competence includes a lot of things we've been talking about: contextual skills, understanding organizational value, thinking about ourselves and providing a consistent delivery, and that often that our competencies develop through some kind of assessment to these skills. It is important, basically, for him that technical competence isn't merely learning how to do stuff, but in some ways, how to understand my own ability and capability in the midst of those doing. And so he moves one step beyond. And he uses this kind of language for why technical competence is important, why we would take time, and I'll just say it in our class, to develop these skill sets that I've been arguing for. He says that stewardship precedes leadership. Biblically, stewardship's about faithfully protecting and preserving what is most important, about growing and developing the potential of everything and everyone under your care. It is about faithfully discharging the duties and carrying responsibilities that we've been authorized to do. It is first and most basic. It is the first and most basic act of a human being, of being human, excuse me, the first charge given in the garden to cultivate and keep. And so, in a way, as we learn these competencies, it's actually our exercising of personal stewardship. Again, I like that language, particularly in light of entrepreneurship thinking, where it's not so much I'm learning these competencies because somebody told me I got to have them in order to be useful inside their system, but I'm learning these competencies so I might learn how to be more useful or a better steward and a more faithful steward of what God has provided. And so technical competency is really a part of what it means to be a transformational leader from Bolsinger's standpoint. Alongside that, he does talk about relational congruence. And what he means by that is how do I relate to others? Do I do this out of a sense of integrity and maturity? How do I curate within myself an emotional health so that I'm working with others in a way that inspires the same thing? How is it that I embrace a real spirituality, a depth of spirituality? And how do I reveal all of that in and through being authentic in how I engage others? So, the same way I develop a skill set of technical competence, I learn how to be relationally congruent to the people I'm trying to lead and empower them. But this third piece is what actually syncs very well with the work of Singay and Heifetz and others, where he argues for, excuse me, an adaptive capacity. And in this, he basically is saying that, yes, we need to learn to see the systemic issues, to calmly confront the unknown, to lead a learning process, and to really know that the best way to demonstrate adaptive ability is expressed primarily in asking questions, not feeling like we have to have the answers. And that for him, this is how we cultivate ourselves individually as leaders in amidst this process of understanding what's going on during adaptive leadership. So Bolsinger, one way to think about it is Hawkins' book is good about helping understand adaptive leadership and systems thinking in and through the vision of the congregation or the organization. Bolsinger is really helpful in thinking about then who am I as I respond to these kinds of dynamic changes that I've been talking about. Probably the limit to Bolsinger's book that connects to what we're doing is that Bolsinger really is focused on the individual, but it still is important for us, and we as we begin to think about the kinds of people we put around us, and even the kinds of people we need in our lives as we move forward, and the kinds of teams that we hope to develop. because there is systems thinking really is also about paying attention to not just the structure, not just the right forms of responsiveness and communication and decision making, but also how is the team recognizing how their decisions change and adapt over time as well. Which means it brings me to one final slide for today, that systems thinking has also permeated the way in which we think about teams also, this dynamic process. And it's happened through two different ways. One is by asking, do teams actually go through some kind of dynamic series of changes as they become a good working team? And there's been a lot of research on how you develop teams. And the most important thing is to recognize that when you put a team together, normally there's a kind of series of stages that they may actually navigate. The first one being kind of pseudo community, where everybody's kind of nice to each other and they're willing to listen to the leader and what we're trying to accomplish, but that at that point they're still kind of suspending some of their own investment. Then there's a period of storming when a team really is sort of jockeying for power within the group. Yeah, there can be critiques and coalitions. Sometimes you can find certain people sort of in an attack mode and how they're engaging each other in the team. And they're not yet willing to share differences or assumptions, but they're more than willing to assume other people's intent. And this kind of stormy period within a team is normally because, again, just not knowing how the team operates well. And so it's not just personalities and people just consumed with wanting power. That will come in, but sometimes that desire for power is because people just don't know yet how the team's going to function, and they may even try to be doing it to help the team along, but still you have this kind of sense of conflict and storming that's going on as a result of it. That normally leads to the period of release of power, where the movement begins to better understand the differences in people, their gifts and graces. They begin to share personal assumptions, a more shared vision, and they become more re-aware of even why they came together as a group to begin with. And finally, and not every team gets there, but a good team finally gets to a kind of a performing, and this is not performance as in hitting certain markers, though that can be important, but this is that in some ways much more like performing like, well, an acting troupe, actually learning to engage with each other in ways that actually are performative, so that the group really acknowledges that the group goals are more important. Real differences of people are discussed and how they approach and deal with things. Assumptions are named, and the tasks are performed more out of a sense of belonging. And that may not always mean that every goal is hit well because well, in a systems world, sometimes the team can't control the outcomes, but at least the team is working well. Um, you can find a lot of written literature on how to lead teams like this. Main thing is that leadership does vary in depending on the stage. So learning to recognize the stage influences the role of the leader, where you might need to be in some ways more of a catalytic period early, then more directive during the storming period, just to remind people how to stay on task while they navigate those things, then to be more of a affirming leader, and then finally to share leadership in the performing era. But most important, learning not how not to react. Honestly, I'll say this: in a lot of churches, rarely in a church, if a church gets to the storming phase, there's a real tendency to not push through that to the norming and performing stages, but actually a lot of times is either to discontinue groups or to let them slide into oblivion. That's the bad news a lot of times in congregations, where a lot of times learning to get through that so that groups can actually see how they are being faithful and God's call in their life might be the most important thing a leader does if they really take care of it. I will mention one final book. I'm not going to talk a lot more about this for the sake of our class, but it's one to take a look at, and that's Patrick Lencioni's book, The Five Dysfunctions of a Team. And he basically is asking the question, what happens when teams do not function well? And it's a really good book. He has a kind of pyramid where he notes that it usually begins first with an inattention to the results, and then teams start to, underneath that, maybe the avoidance of accountability and a lack of commitment. And a little bit closer to the bottom is a fear of conflict. But ultimately, the base of the pyramid, or sometimes you might think about it this way, is the bottom of the iceberg. Is an that really what hurts a team more than anything is an absence of trust, that they can't trust each other and trust the vision. And sometimes all we see is the tip of the iceberg, the inattention to results, not just bad results, but just lack of attention to them by leaders in the team. And that should at least spark within us other things that we should be asking as we go forward. Well, I'll close with that just to say that as much as we want to think about the organization and it manifests itself, the organization's culture, we have to also understand the dynamics of an organization as it goes through change, including your own role as a leader and the roles of teams and what they do in helping or harming this navigation as time goes along. So hope this has been helpful for you. Look forward to seeing you guys in class. And if you have any questions about this material as we gather together, let me know. Blessings. Take care.